She mistook your loyalty for weakness. And that is one of the most common and most painful misjudgments in the dynamics between men and women. When a man gives, when he shows up day after day with patience, with commitment, with an open heart, it's often perceived not as strength, but as predictability, as if your reliability somehow makes you lesser, as if your willingness to stay through the storm means you don't have the power to walk away from it. But loyalty is not a passive trait. It's a disciplined act of choice. It's waking up each day and deciding to keep showing up, not because you have no options, but because your values anchor you. You believed in the connection, in the potential of what you both could be. So you stayed even when it was inconvenient, even when your needs were unmet, even when the energy you poured in was absorbed without thank. And because you stayed, she assumed you always would. That's where the fracture begins. When someone starts to believe that your presence is guaranteed, they begin to test it. Maybe not maliciously, but through neglect, indifference, or inconsistency. They start to believe the lie that you'll always be there. That no matter how far they pull away, you'll keep chasing. That no matter how many times they shut down emotionally, you'll keep knocking at the door with understanding in your hands. And the truth is, for a while, you do. Not because you're naive, not because you're desperate, but because there's a certain strength in a man who holds steady, even when it would be easier to leave. A man who doesn't flinch at emotional volatility. A man who gives the benefit of the doubt again and again, because he wants the relationship to succeed more than he wants to be right. But she didn't see that. She didn't see the strength in your stillness, the dignity in your loyalty. Instead, she saw a safety net, something soft to fall back on. And maybe she even began to resent it, because when you show up too consistently for someone who's not emotionally ready to meet you there, they begin to feel exposed. Your stability becomes a mirror to their chaos. And instead of stepping up to meet you, they begin to chip away at your foundation, testing just how much you'll tolerate. You tolerated a lot. You tolerated silence where there should have been clarity. You tolerated mood swings and hot and cold affection. You tolerated being an afterthought, a backup plan, a steady presence taken for granted. And every time you forgave without real change, she saw a man she could push further, not because she hated you, but because she didn't yet understand the cost of losing you. She thought loyalty meant permanence, that no matter what she said or didn't say, you would still be there. That your love came with an unspoken clause, unconditional patience, unending availability, but love is not obligation. It is not surrendering your worth for someone else's comfort. And one day, something shifted in you. A moment of stillness turned into clarity. You realized that loyalty does not mean self-abandonment. You realized that staying isn't strength if it costs you your self-respect. That enduring mistreatment in the name of commitment only teaches the other person that they never have to grow. And that's when something inside you quietly said, enough. Not with rage, not with resentment, but with the calm decisiveness of someone who finally remembers his own value. And that's when she felt it. The energy changed. The silence wasn't passive anymore. It was resolute. The distance wasn't emotional fatigue. It was a boundary. You were no longer waiting for her to realize what she had. You were no longer trying to prove your worth. And in that space, she began to panic. Not because you left, but because she never thought you would. See, she never believed your absence was even possible. She believed you needed her more than you needed your peace. But she was wrong. And when that realization hit, it wasn't dramatic. It was sobering. She didn't lose a man who was desperate for her. She lost a man who was willing to give her everything until she treated it like it was nothing. And the weight of that truth will stay with her longer than your presence ever did. You see, when you left, it wasn't just your presence that vanished. It was the emotional safety she didn't even know she relied on. That steady presence, the reliability, the quiet strength you carried, that was her anchor, even though she never said it. And this is the paradox. People rarely acknowledge the impact of your presence until they're faced with the consequences of its absence. While you were there, she could afford to be indifferent. She could afford to be inconsistent, not necessarily out of malice, but because she believed in some deep emotional corner of her psyche that you weren't going anywhere. You were the emotional constant in her life, her safe place. The one she could vent to, lean on, ignore, push away, and still expect to be standing there the next day. But when you finally walked away, not with fireworks, not with screaming or accusations, but with quiet resolve, it shook her. Not just because you were gone, but because she had built parts of her identity around your presence. And here's where it gets psychologically complex. People often don't miss the person. They miss the feeling they had when that person was around. They miss the emotional security, the confidence that someone would be there even when they didn't deserve it. And that kind of comfort is addictive, even when it's underappreciated. She began to feel the silence. Not just hear it, but feel it. The space where your voice used to be. The absence of your emotional support during her low moments. The missing encouragement when she doubted herself. The lack of grounding when her thoughts started spinning. She didn't just lose a boyfriend or a partner. She lost an emotional stabilizer. One she never admitted she depended on. Because when you were around, she didn't have to question herself. You gave her clarity about her beauty, her worth, her potential. You reminded her of who she could be, even when she couldn't see it for herself. You were the mirror that showed her something noble, something secure. And now that mirror is gone. Now she's left looking into her own reflection without the reinforcement she once took for granted. And it's disorienting. You didn't leave with resentment. You didn't storm out demanding acknowledgement. You just stopped showing up. You stopped texting first. You stopped checking in. You stopped reminding her of the things she didn't believe about herself. And this absence, this quiet, deliberate withdrawal, it's louder than any argument. Because it wasn't about making a point. It was about reclaiming your peace. And now she's replaying the moments, wondering when the shift happened, thinking about all the times she dismissed your feelings, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't believe your needs would ever surpass your loyalty to her. She thought you'd tolerate it forever. She didn't realize that strength has a limit, and when a man finds that threshold, he doesn't flinch, he doesn't threaten, he leaves. The real weight of your absence is emotional. It's not about whether she sees you at a coffee shop or whether you unfollowed her on social media. It's the internal absence. The space you once filled in her world that now echoes. It's not rage or revenge. It's the loss of something sacred, something stable, something irreplaceable. And ironically, that's when she starts to feel the very things she never wanted to admit. The respect that came too late, the gratitude that arrives after the fact, the understanding of your value when it's no longer available. Because now she has to self-soothe. Now she has to face her own insecurities without you reminding her of her strengths. Now she has to navigate emotional uncertainty without your grounding voice on the other end. And for the first time, she realizes that what she thought was guaranteed was actually a gift that had an expiration date, a gift that wasn't owed but offered, a gift she misread as weakness when it was actually discipline in its highest form. She never thought you'd actually walk away. She never thought you'd choose silence over one more conversation that leads nowhere. She never thought the man who held space for her pain would one day protect his own. But now she knows. And knowing that, feeling that, is the kind of lesson that lingers far longer than anything you could have said. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How someone can only begin to understand your worth when they feel your absence echo through their life like a haunting. It's not that they never noticed your presence. They did, but they noticed it the way we noticed air, taken for granted until it's gone, until it becomes so desperately missed that its absence feels like suffocation. Because there's something unsettling about realizing that the things you did out of love, the care you gave so freely, were absorbed without appreciation. Not because she was cruel, but because she thought you'd always be there. She thought your consistency was a permanent feature in her life, a background comfort, always present, never questioned. Because you never made her feel the cost of your loyalty, she never thought to examine its value. So now, in your absence, she's beginning to recount. Not just the big gestures, not the flowers or the gifts or the plans, no, What stings the most are the small, consistent, almost invisible things you did. The check-ins when she was overwhelmed but didn't ask for help. The subtle way you read her energy and adjusted your approach without making a scene. The calm you brought when her emotions spun out of control. The way you remembered the little details, not because you had to, but because you cared. And here's what makes it more painful for, now that you're gone, no one else is doing those things. No one else understands her in the quiet, intuitive way you did. No one else sees the storm behind her silence. She's surrounded by people who ask the right questions but don't listen for the right answers. And it's jarring because she had that once. She had someone who anticipated her needs, who offered support without making her feel weak, who gave without keeping score, and she never thought that would end. But now it has. And now she's searching for something that's not easily replaced. She's trying to fill a gap that's shaped like your emotional integrity, your patience, your presence. It's not that she didn't love you, but sometimes people confuse security with boredom. They mistake emotional reliability for passivity, and that's the tragedy. The very things that made you a pillar in her life were the things she underestimated. Until they were gone, she's learning now. Learning that not everyone loves like you did. Not everyone listens without trying to fix. Not everyone holds space without trying to dominate it. She's learning that your kind of love, rooted in calm strength, in stability, in consistency, is rare, and that it's far more valuable than she ever realized when she had it. And there's a strange irony in how time has a way of revealing truth. Now she's looking back at moments she once brushed off and realizing they were meaningful. She's remembering the times you were patient when she was difficult and seeing now that it was grace, not weakness. She's recalling how you stood by her when she pushed you away and recognizing it as emotional depth, not desperation. But what's done is done, because you didn't leave in anger, you didn't try to prove a point, you simply stopped giving where you were no longer valued. That kind of departure hits differently. It leaves behind no drama, no scenes, just an undeniable absence, and it forces reflection. Forces her to face the imbalance she once ignored, forces her to sit with the knowledge that someone good, someone real, walked away, not to punish, but to preserve himself. And that's the part she'll never forget. Not the love you gave her, not the way you made her feel, but the silence you left behind. Because it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything she didn't say, everything she didn't do, and everything she took for granted. That silence is louder than any words you could have spoken. It says everything, and it lingers. So now she knows. Maybe not enough to say it out loud, maybe not enough to admit it to anyone else, but deep down in that quiet place where pride can't reach, she knows. She knows what she lost. And she knows it didn't have to end this way. And that knowledge will follow her. There's a certain discomfort in confronting the reality that actions or inactions have consequences, especially when they stem from assumptions. She assumed you wouldn't leave. She assumed your forgiveness was infinite, that your loyalty was a constant, like the sun rising or the seasons changing. She assumed you'd always be available to absorb the impact of her moods, her doubts, her inconsistency. And she believed that love was some unconditional state of grace, not something that, if mishandled long enough, begins to fade quietly into indifference. The truth is, she never really believed you'd follow through. That's the strange part. Not because she thought you were weak, but because she thought you were hers. Not in the possessive sense, but in the subtle, taken for granted way people categorize the constants in their lives. You became part of her emotional furniture. Reliable, sturdy, familiar, and somewhere along the line, she stopped tending to that dynamic. She stopped nurturing what was once alive between you and instead let it run on autopilot. She may not have even noticed at the time. That's how slow erosion works. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps in during moments of neglect, when the effort becomes optional, when connection is replaced by assumption. She knew, of course, on some level that you were pulling back. She noticed the small silences growing longer. She felt the shift in your energy. But instead of addressing it, she dismissed it. He's just tired. Or he'll get over it. Because she believed the story she had built in her head that no matter what, you'd stay. And so she kept testing the limits, often unconsciously, pushing boundaries, withdrawing affection, weaponizing distance, seeing how far she could stretch the cord before it snapped. And then one day, it did. You didn't leave in a blaze of anger. There wasn't a final fight or a grand declaration. It was more subtle than that. You simply stopped, waiting to be seen. You stopped reminding her of your worth. You stopped accepting breadcrumbs and calling it love, and you walked away, not because you stopped caring, but because caring alone wasn't enough to hold it together anymore. And that was the moment it hit her. Not during the arguments, not during the cold nights or the passive-aggressive silences, but when you actually left, when you stopped responding, when you didn't check in, when you didn't chase her anymore. That's when the realization dawned. You were serious. You were done. You weren't bluffing. And the silence that followed was deafening. Now she's left with the uncomfortable recognition that she miscalculated. Not your value, that was never really in question, but your breaking point. She didn't think you had one. And the truth is, maybe you didn't for a long time. Maybe you gave more chances than you should have. Maybe you waited too long, hoping something would change. But eventually, something inside you shifted. The peace you once fought for with her began to look more attainable without her. And here's what makes it so difficult for her to process. It's not just that you're gone. It's that you're okay being gone. You didn't collapse. You didn't beg. You didn't spiral. You moved on with your dignity intact. And that says more than any angry outburst or emotional plea ever could. It says you've grown. It says you value yourself enough not to stay where you aren't fully respected. And that is the most powerful form of closure you could offer. None at all. Because now the weight is on her. Not in a cruel way, but in an inevitable way. She has to live with the version of events where she played a role in losing something rare, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't believe it could disappear. She has to replay moments where she could have chosen humility over pride, vulnerability over distance, effort over complacency. But she didn't. And now those moments have expired. The window is closed. You see, people don't regret love they gave. They regret love they didn't honor. And deep inside, she knows what you gave her was real. What you offered her was rare. But she treated it like a constant rather than a choice. And now, for the first time, she's forced to see love not as a promise, but as a responsibility. And she's learning, too late, that neglect has a cost. You didn't leave to teach her a lesson. You left because staying was starting to teach you the wrong one. There's a moment, often long after the relationship has ended, when she begins to replay everything. Not the grand gestures or the memorable dates. That's not what lingers. What haunts her is the accumulation of all the little things you did without expecting praise or acknowledgement. Things she barely noticed, or worse, dismissed. You didn't do them for recognition. You weren't trying to earn her affection. You simply acted out of care, out of devotion, out of a belief that love is demonstrated in consistency, not declarations. It's the silent sacrifices, the invisible emotional labor that now rings loudly in her memory. The way you picked up the slack when she was too overwhelmed to function, even if you were tired yourself. The way you remembered her schedule, her preferences, her unspoken needs. Not because she told you to, but because you paid attention. It's not that she never saw it, she just didn't believe it required acknowledgement. Somewhere along the way, she started to believe that your effort was a given, that your emotional presence was something owed rather than offered. And now that absence is jarring, because the void you left behind isn't empty, it's full of all the things you used to do. It's full of the quiet strength you brought into her chaos, the emotional steadiness that made her feel safe, even when she couldn't admit she needed it. It's the kind of loss you don't feel immediately. It creeps in over time. A dish left in the sink, a long day without someone checking in, an accomplishment with no one to share it with. That's when the regret sharpens. Because the truth is, when you were there, she thought those things were small. But now that they're gone, they feel enormous. It's a bitter kind of clarity, this recognition of what she had only after it's gone. And it's not just sadness, it's shame. Because she realizes she underestimated you, not in terms of capability or intelligence, but in terms of emotional depth. She mistook your calmness for weakness, your patience for passivity. And because you didn't demand recognition, she assumed you didn't need it. But everyone needs to feel appreciated. Everyone wants to be seen. You were just too noble to beg for it. She thought strength meant emotional detachment, that the one who cared less was the one in control. But now she understands the deeper truth. The strongest person is often the one who dares to care deeply and still stands tall when it's not reciprocated. You weren't weak for loving her fully. You were strong because you did it despite the risk. And you were even stronger for walking away when it became clear your love was being taken for granted. And now she's left trying to reconcile with a version of you that no longer needs her validation. And that's the part that truly unsettles her. Not that you're gone, but that you've reclaimed your dignity in the process. That you didn't try to prove your worth one last time. That you didn't give her one more chance to hurt you in the same way. You simply decided your kindness was no longer going to be overlooked. And that decision, that quiet assertion of self-worth, is something she didn't expect, because for a long time, she held the emotional leverage. She believed she could dictate the rhythm of the relationship, knowing you'd always adjust to meet her where she was. But when you finally stopped dancing to that tune, everything changed. The power shifted, not through aggression or confrontation, but through withdrawal, through silence, through absence. There's a certain kind of emptiness that follows the departure of someone who gave without condition. It's not loud. It doesn't come with a dramatic exit. It's more like a room slowly going dark. The warmth fades, the light dims, and you don't realize how much you depended on it until you try to navigate without it. She's navigating now alone, surrounded by the echo of all the things you once did, realizing too late that they were acts of love, not obligation. You didn't leave to punish her. You left because love without respect is erosion. And you were eroding. You left not because you stopped loving her, but because you started loving yourself enough to stop being invisible in the relationship. And that, more than anything, is the lesson she'll carry. And maybe one day she'll find herself doing the dishes or walking home in silence and think of you, not with anger, but with the quiet reverence we reserve for the people we wronged without fully understanding why. Sometimes the most painful part of walking away isn't the separation itself, it's the aftermath. The moment when she realizes that everything she thought was permanent is now just a memory you no longer revisit. Because she always assumed that no matter what happened, you'd still hold space for her. That somewhere in your heart, even if fractured, there'd be a quiet corner reserved just for her. That she could drift away, grow distant, even hurt you, and still have access to the version of you that once cared unconditionally. But she was wrong. And nothing shakes someone more deeply than discovering that the door they always assumed would stay open has been quietly, firmly closed. But what stings isn't just that you left, it's that you truly let go. You stopped checking in. You stopped responding with warmth. You stopped caring about what she thought, where she was, or whether she missed you. You didn't do it out of bitterness. You didn't lash out or try to make her feel the same pain you endured. No, you just moved on with a quiet dignity that screamed louder than any outburst ever could. And that's what changed everything. You see, she expected pain, she anticipated regret, but she didn't expect peace from you. She didn't anticipate that you would find clarity in her absence, that instead of falling apart, you would reassemble yourself, stronger, more grounded, less dependent on anyone else's recognition to validate your worth. That realization, for her, was a quiet devastation, because as long as you were in pain, she still had a place in your story. But peace meant she had been written out, and that's something she never prepared for. She thought your silence would be temporary, a phase, maybe even a tactic. She thought eventually you'd come back around, maybe not to rekindle what was lost, but at least to orbit again, to offer the same warmth, the same availability, the same emotional presence you once gave so freely. But that didn't happen. And the longer your silence stretched, the more final it began to feel, until it dawned on her, you weren't being distant, you were... And what followed wasn't anger, it was confusion. Because for someone who never truly saw the depth of what you offered, it's hard to comprehend how deeply you've reclaimed it. She underestimated the strength it takes to detach from someone you once loved without apology, to walk away not out of pride, but out of clarity, to stop asking to be seen and instead go where you already are. Now she replays the moments when she could have held on tighter, said what mattered, offered gratitude instead of indifference. She wonders how many times she rolled her eyes when you reached out, how often she dismissed your care as overbearing, or worse, needy. And now, faced with your absence, she realizes it wasn't neediness, it was love. And it scares her, because she finally understands that she won't find it again in someone who tolerates being treated as optional. You taught her something she didn't know she needed to learn. That not everyone waits forever, that not all hearts stay open just because you think they should. That sometimes, when you push someone away long enough, they find the strength to stop returning. And when they do, they don't slam the door. They just walk through it for the last time, leaving you standing in the silence you helped create. It's not revenge, it's resolution. It's the understanding that loving someone shouldn't cost you your self-respect. That forgiveness doesn't require proximity. That healing isn't about getting the other person to understand your pain. It's about freeing yourself from the need for them to understand it at all. And now she sees it. Not just the version of you she took for granted, but the version of herself that believed you'd never walk away. She sees that her control wasn't love, her detachment wasn't strength, and your patience wasn't weakness. She sees how love can leave quietly, without drama, and still shake your world. Because when you stop chasing what refuses to be held and begin living as if you never needed it in the first place, that's when everything changes, not for her, but for you. And in that transformation, she loses something irreplaceable.